The first thing you learn is that resistance does not begin with courage. It begins with humiliation. A uniform at the corner, a poster pasted over the old flag, boots on the stairs above your apartment at 3 in the morning, then silence, which is worse. The occupation does not only take roads and railways. It takes posture. It bends backs in breadlines. It lowers voices in kitchens. It teaches your city to look down at its own shoes. At first, your war is small enough to fit inside your coat pocket. A scrap of newsprint folded into a matchbox. A name memorized, then swallowed. A loaf of bread delivered to a door that should remain closed. Outsiders imagine the underground begins with bombs and pistols and coded midnight meetings. Usually it begins with being useful. You are 20, or 19, or 43, with a limp from the last war. It hardly matters. The system notices who can pass unnoticed. That is your first qualification. You are ordinary enough to survive a search. So they give you errands, a bicycle with weak brakes. A satchel lined with old fabric so documents will not crackle when you ride. Instructions given once, in a flat voice, across a table scrubbed too clean. Never carry more than you can burn. Never ask for surnames. Never arrive directly. If a curtain is half drawn, keep moving. If the church bell rings twice after the hour, do not knock. There is no ceremony. No oath spoken over candlelight. Just a door closing behind you and the sensation that your former life, the one with clear edges and innocent mistakes, has ended without announcement. You become a courier before you become anything else, which means you become a student of weather, tram schedules, facial expressions, and fear. Fear has texture now. It is the sweat trapped beneath wool gloves. It is the policeman who lets his gaze remain on you 1 second too long. It is the metal click inside your own throat when you realize the woman beside you on the tram is carrying eggs, and you are carrying names. And if either of you drops what you hold, both lives break at once. You pedal through streets where collaboration and hunger live door to door. A tobacconist nods at German officers by day and passes ration cards to widows by night. A schoolteacher hides carbons and ink under arithmetic books. A priest gives sermons about patience while memorizing rail timetables for men who plan explosions. This is the second lesson. Resistance is not a single brotherhood of clean heroes. It is a nervous system, frayed, improvised, often compromised. And every pulse through it depends on people like you crossing a city without attracting the eye. For a while, that is enough to carry, to listen, to say little. Then one morning, the man you know only as Victor does not arrive at the cafe. His chair remains empty through 2 songs on the radio and the arrival of the milk cart. Nobody says the word arrested. Nobody has to. In occupied Europe, absence develops a grammar of its own. By evening, the errands change. You are no longer moving messages. You are replacing the hands that wrote them. The cellar smells of damp paper and machine oil. There is a mimeograph press under blankets, stacks of stencils, jars of paste, forged work permits drying on a line like laundry. The war that seemed to belong to trains and artillery now lives in typefaces, seals, margins, and spelling. A single misplaced accent can expose a counterfeit pass. A smudged date can kill a family at a checkpoint. You learn to cut identity into layers: official stamp, local signature, the right kind of paper, the right fatigue in the handwriting. You discover that occupation is bureaucratic before it is theatrical. It conquers with forms, so you fight with forms. At night, you print leaflets by the hundreds. News from London, news from Algiers. News the enemy calls rumor because truth is dangerous when it travels cheaply. Your fingers blacken with ink that never entirely leaves the skin. In the morning, the city wakes to find forbidden pages tucked into tram seats, slipped beneath bakery doors, pinned inside factory washrooms. Tiny acts. That is how all this works. A phrase on a wall, a line in a leaflet, a joke whispered in the wrong barracks. Occupation depends on inevitability. Resistance survives by making inevitability look thin. But paper is not enough for long. Paper can reassure. It cannot stop trains. Soon the cell asks more of you because the war asks more of everyone. One winter night, you are taken beyond the freight yards to meet a mechanic with missing fingertips and a former law student who now carries blasting caps in a violin case. The conversation is dull on purpose. Coal deliveries, axle loads, switch timings. The kind of details a state forgets are mortal. You spend 3 weeks learning where a railway line is vulnerable, how many minutes a patrol pauses near the signal box, how to count distance in the dark with frozen hands. This is what outsiders do not understand about sabotage. It is not chaos. It is patience under pressure, precision in misery. The first time you help cut a line, nothing explodes. There is only the scrape of tools, the iron smell of wet earth, the white cloud of your breath, and the unbearable loudness of a distant dog barking somewhere beyond the embankment. You leave before dawn. 12 hours later, a munitions train stalls 3 provinces away. You never see it. Most of resistance is like that. Consequence without witness. You risk your life for an outcome measured by strangers, and then the reprisals begin. Hostage notices on the wall. 10 shot here, 20 there, a mayor removed. A village searched room by room. You tell yourself the tracks would have carried shells anyway. That delay saves lives somewhere else. That war does not offer clean arithmetic. Still, numbers become faces. A tobacconist, a clerk, 2 brothers from the mill. The cost of striking the machine is that the machine punishes whatever is nearest. It teaches you a darker lesson now. Moral clarity is often reserved for people far from the scene. By the time spring comes, you have become harder to surprise. That is not the same as becoming hard. You can disassemble a pistol, strip a false bottom from a suitcase, recite an address only once and forget it on command. You know which railway workers can be trusted and which merely hate being watched. You know how to stand in a queue as if your whole life is a queue. But the deeper you go, the smaller your life becomes. No full names, no diaries, no old friends. Your mother asks why you no longer stay for soup. The woman you once planned to marry says you vanish even while sitting in front of her. She is right. The underground does not only hide you from the occupier, it hides you from yourself. Then comes the radio. It arrives in 2 suitcases with worn corners and a smell of dust and hot wire. Suddenly, the cell is no longer provincial. London is in the room. So are requests, delays, coded poems, weather phrases, supply drops, accusations, hope. Wireless is power condensed into minutes. Too many minutes, and the detector vans begin to circle. You learn to string an aerial in an attic, transmit fast, dismantle faster, move before the pattern hardens. Every burst of Morse feels like tapping on the inside of a coffin, hoping the right people hear. Now you are not just carrying risk, you are generating it. The hierarchy changes around you almost without formal announcement. The old courier routes are yours to assign. The safe houses report to you, though nobody says report. You decide who knows what, who waits, who disappears for a month, because one neighbor has started noticing too much. Leadership in a resistance cell does not feel like elevation. It feels like being handed other people's lives with the instruction not to tremble. And that is when betrayal becomes more frightening than force. Every underground eventually develops its mythology of infiltration, the comrade who talked under torture, the lover who noticed too much, the opportunist who sold names for coal or cash or mere survival. You tell yourself your cell is careful. You keep compartments. You rotate apartments. You never meet in the same basement twice. Then one evening, a courier fails to arrive, and before midnight another safe house goes dark, and by dawn a code phrase is spoken back to you with a hesitation that does not belong there. The net is closing. From that point on, time behaves differently. Streets narrow, stairwells echo. A passing car becomes an argument between instinct and reason. You burn paper in a stove until the room smells like a schoolhouse fire. You bury a pistol in a courtyard garden and mark the place by counting 3 paving stones from the pump. You move the radio twice in one night. You tell a 17-year-old messenger not to come back, knowing he may interpret dismissal as safety when there is none left to offer. And still the work continues, because collapse has its own deadlines. There are downed airmen to move south. There is a shipment to redirect. There are names that must reach another district before the arrests spread like oil on water. This is perhaps the cruelest truth of the resistance life. Exposure does not grant relief. It only sharpens obligation. When they finally come for you, it is not dramatic. No midnight battering ram. No shouted confession. Just a gray afternoon, a street you have used too often, and two men stepping from a doorway with the bland confidence of clerks. One touches your elbow almost politely. The other takes your satchel. In that instant, every object acquires terrible, meaning the bread knife in a nearby window, the child dragging a hoop across cobbles, the damp seam in the wall above a fountain. The world remains ordinary, which is precisely what makes terror so complete. Interrogation strips history down to appetite. How long can a body protect a secret once sleep, heat, time, and pain are turned against it with methodical skill? Much of the legend people tell about resistance is built around grand defiance, heroic silence, the final insult hurled across the table. Sometimes that happened. Often what happened was more human, and therefore more terrible. Confusion, exhaustion, bargains made with oneself in units of minutes. You learn that courage is not a permanent condition. It flickers, it fails, it returns in fragments. A name withheld, an address altered by one digit, a pause long enough for someone else to run. Maybe you escape and transfer. Maybe bribery, paperwork, and luck pry open a hinge in the system. Maybe an air raid cracks the timetable, and the cell's remnants pull you through the seam. However it happens, you emerge into the last phase of the war, less like a hero than like a man partially burned away. By then, the ranks beneath the title have all passed through you. Errand runner, forger's assistant, saboteur, wireless operator, organizer, suspect, fugitive. Each role promised greater importance than the last. None mentioned the erosion, the narrowed emotional range, the way every kindness begins to feel like bait, the way liberation itself, when it finally arrives with church bells and flags and drunken embraces, can seem almost indecently loud. Because victory does not restore the dead. It does not explain which compromises were necessary, and which were simply convenient. It does not return the version of you who once believed identity was a stable thing. The city celebrates in public squares while you stand at the edge, searching faces for those who are missing and those who survived in ways you cannot yet understand. Women emerge from prisons weighing almost nothing. Men from forests blink at daylight. Like animals, collaborators shave their stories as quickly as their insignia. Everyone claims a cleaner conscience than the years allow. After the war, people ask what rank you held, as if the underground mirrored an army, as if courage could be cataloged by insignia. They want structure because structure is comforting. It suggests the suffering moved upward in an orderly chain, that someone always knew more, decided more, controlled more. But inside a resistance cell, rank is mostly another word for proximity to consequences. The higher you rise, the fewer illusions survive. You do not become grander, you become more contaminated by knowledge. And yet, the smallest memory endures. Not the explosives, not the codes, not the men with pistols under their coats. It is the bicycle chain against your ankle on that first cold morning, the weight of a matchbox in your pocket, the way the woman at the safe house did not ask your name when she opened the door, only stepped aside as if she had been expecting someone like you for centuries. That is what this life finally was. Not glory, not even resistance in the abstract. Just ordinary people, cornered by history, discovering that secrecy could become a form of citizenship and sacrifice a language spoken mostly in whispers. If there is a lesson in it, it is not that you would have been fearless. Most were not. It is that occupation rearranges the scale of a human life until carrying paper can matter as much as carrying a rifle, until silence can be labor, until one unnoticed person on a bicycle can hold together, for another hour, the torn nerve endings of a nation. And when the story ends, it never really ends. The war leaves, but the habits remain. You still scan exits, still mistrust a sudden knock, still divide the world into those who ask unnecessary questions, and those who understand why names should sometimes remain unspoken. In peacetime, these instincts look excessive. In memory, they feel like rent paid on survival. So when people imagine a resistance cell, they picture the dramatic center, the pistol, the armband, the coded broadcast snapping through static. They miss the deeper truth. A clandestine life is built from repetition, from waiting, from carrying, from not being seen until the moment being seen destroys you. Every rank in that hidden world is really the same lesson told at a higher cost. You begin as someone who can pass unnoticed. If you last long enough, you become someone who can never be ordinary again. Even afterward, when children chalk games onto the pavement where informers once waited, you understand something victory cannot advertise. Freedom is not the opposite of fear. It is the duty to live while remembering what fear required of everyone. If this story stays with you, let it stay there, in that distance between the two.